We're sitting at the junction of Cowbridge and Hartham Lane. Can you explain what that little building is, that little triangular building that people see as you go to Sainsbury's?
Yeah, the little building on the apex of the site, if you like, was once the sampling room, and where every Monday morning the brewers and the directors used to come into the building to sample the beers that had just been produced, and they would be racked up and on stillage in the space, and they would all come in and try the beers, and if they were good enough to go, they would go straight out to the pubs. If you were lucky enough to be on a brewery trip back in the day, probably in the 1970s and 80s, you would be brought through this space, and you would be offered a beer in this area too.
So how long has McMullens been brewing on this site in particular? I know there's a long history in the town of various sites, but on this particular site?
Well, come about the late 1880s, I think the situation would have been that they were brewing on 2 or 3 sites in the town and also in Ware, and there was a great sort of clamour for their beers, particularly the AK, which is a beer that has a heritage going back to the 1830s, and they must have decided at the time that they needed to consolidate, so they employed William Bradford, who was a renowned brewery designer, to come and make use of the space and to see what he could do with it. And so by 1981 up had gone this Tower Brewery in the centre of town, and brewing started.
How long was the continuous period of brewery in this building?
The brewery opened in 1891 after being designed by William Bradford, who was a renowned brewery designer, and kept brewing right way through to the mid-1990s. It never really stopped, even after a new brewery building was built behind this one. So there was always a time where things were still going on in this building.
That's the building that's no longer there now, isn't it?
That's the building that was built in the 1980s. It was mainly built as a lager brewery initially, and basically that's been demolished and is now under the supermarket.
And what happened then? What's the new building across Hartham Lane from here?
Well, once this building was sold to the developers, McMullens had already decided in the early 2000s that they needed to move their brewing all onto the one site. So they moved their whole exercise onto the other side of Hartham Lane, on the town side of Hartham Lane, and a brand new building, a brand new brewery was put into existing warehousing there, and that opened in 2004.
It's a far more compact brewery now, isn't it, than it used to be?
Well, I think they've taken, so everything's moved on in life, and as indeed brewery design has moved on, so it's a brand new stainless steel brewery in there which has a capability of expanding should Max need to brew more beer than they're currently doing. Very compact, it follows a natural line from the start of the brewing. It's all on pretty much one level, 1.5 levels, and they've also got a little microbrewery in there now where they're doing some special beers.
So Hertford's really ideal for a brewery, isn't it? I mean, it's got its aquifer and transport links. And
well, certainly Max have their own aquifer. They had 2 wells that were dug down 60 metres into the London aquifer, and of course many would say that to some extent has that's how their beers taste. You know, they're using the water from the local area. It probably is treated to some extent to give it certain brewing sort of advantages. But yeah, certainly in Hertford it's good links, transport links around the county.
You've mentioned the sampling room, and we're in the ground floor now. What else happened in this area?
Well, much of the area we're in now is open stabling, so there would have been a great noise of drays coming in, dropping down barrels and loading up barrels and taking them out, and this would have of course been done by horse-drawn dray to start with. What would have happened was horse-drawn drays would have been bringing empty barrels into the courtyard over the cobbled stones and loading up and taking them out the other side. So you can imagine the quietness of a gallery these days is quite anathema to what would have been here before.
Now, part of the tasting room you mentioned earlier is a staircase down to a very exciting space, which is the old cellar area.
I think a couple of things probably were going on in those areas. Firstly, there was a storage area for grain and hops that were being brought in to use in the brewing process. And certainly further round, there's a whole area which would have been for cleaning barrels and for washing barrels, etc., and then actually filling the barrels. So the racking area of the brewery, from which they were loaded onto the trays and were taken out to the pubs.
It must have been quite an atmosphere, because there's no evidence of lighting down there at all. I was looking for gas lights or something, but it must have been very dingy down there.
Well, I suppose it might have been. I'm not sure how they would have lit that area at the time. Having gone down there many times in the 1970s and 80s on brewery trips, it never struck me as being particularly dark, but the whole area was quite noisy at the time, with 4 or 5 people down there doing the work that they needed to do to get those barrels cleaned and ready to be filled.
So when did you last see it as a functioning space for brewing?
I think that would have been in the mid-1990s, I think, yeah.
So McMullens is actually quite a significant brewery in terms of CAMRA and the heritage of brewing in this county and the country.
That's true. When CAMRA started in the 1970s, McMullens was the last independent brewery left in the county, and so people were driving out to the pubs that were selling their beers in the way we liked, which were cask conditioned beers without the use of any gas to bring it to the bar, so more often than not that's by use of hand pumps, but sometimes directly from the barrel. However, Max at the time, there was some of the board at the time were very much thinking that they should put CO2 through their beer, and it took us probably 3 or 4 years to convince them that it should be back to basics and keep the beer as they should be in our view. We've got to remember at the time the country was being swamped by keg beers from large conglomerates who seemed to have little care for what they were doing to the brewing tradition. So CAMRA's point of view was to try and promote British beers, and McMullens were deep in the heart of that in our early thinking. So many of our branch visits and many of our tours and meetings were held in McMullens pubs at the time.
So how big is the McMullens portfolio in terms of pubs they own?
They currently have roughly 135 pubs. It varies, it goes up slightly, it goes down slightly. The nature of their pubs probably has changed slightly. They used to have lots of street corner pubs and small village locals, etc. They probably don't look to buy any pubs of that sort anymore, but they have much more in the way of destination pubs. And of course, once upon a time, they very much centred in East Hertfordshire and around Hertford and Ware, etc. But in recent times, certainly since 2000, they've been looking to acquire pubs all around the home counties.
So they've got quite a canny system there for acquiring property, haven't they?
They do have a group of people within the company whose specific job is to go and look and find new pubs for the company.
With 135 pubs, there must be a big demand for AK and Country as a standard Great British beer.
I think there is, particularly in the East Hertfordshire area where Max have traditionally brewed. They do, of course, need to keep brewing the AKs and the Countries of this world to satisfy the people who have been brought up on it and want to drink it every day of the week if they can. But at the same time, they need to look forward to a changing brewing scene, and so brew new beers that would meet with the demands of other groups of drinkers.
Is that scene accelerating, expanding still?
I think it's expanding all the time and changing. So for instance, at the moment there's a great interest in beers that are coming from hopped with hops from America. Citric beers, for instance, it's very popular at the moment. It probably will always be popular, but will it be as popular as it is now, or will it drop back and the more traditional beers come forward, or another type of beer come forward? That's the beauty of the changing world of British brewing.
So with Mac's reduced capacity these days, there's got to be a pretty slick operation, hasn't it?
Well, they're still serving 135 pubs. They don't sell much or deal too much with the free trade. But those pubs are spread all over the southeast now, way outside of the original trading area. And they have a whole group of people not just working in the brewery, but in dispatch and promotion and acquisitive staff looking for new properties, etc. So yes, it's a very largest family brewers still, and there are a diminishing number of family brewers left in the country.
It's nice to see they resisted any temptation to just sell out and become part of something bigger, isn't it?
Well, I think it is quite interesting that the family have taken that view over. They're now on the 6th generation of people from the family working at the brewery, and long may that continue. That seems to bring a lot of continuity to the organisation. I think the brewery is very important to the town. I mean, obviously, the old Victorian brewery is a landmark in the town now, and there are a whole number of pubs still, McMullens pubs, left in the town as well, and in Ware as well nearby.
So for a long time, McMullens has been a vital part of this community.
I think it has, going all those years back to 1827 when the brewery started, and certainly in recent times under the current management they're much more looking to open up into the community with family open days and other events locally to put Max deep in the heart of what's going on in Hertford.